and welcome to South Carolina's installment of Farm Bureau's Voices of Agriculture. I'm your host, Reggie Hall. During this special Black History Month installment of Farm Bureau's Voices of Agriculture from South Carolina, we're going to take a look at the proud heritage and promising future of African American farmers in South Carolina. That story will be told by two educators and historians, as well as by farmers themselves who are passionate about their heritage, their endeavors now, and their future in agriculture in South Carolina. All that and more is coming up next on this special installment of Farm Bureau's Voices of Agriculture. Hello and welcome back to South Carolina's installment of Farm Bureau's Voices of Agriculture. This is our special Black History Month installment. Agriculture plays a key role in America's life, but especially so in the life of African Americans. We'll learn that the small family farm structure dominated African American lifestyle from the early 1600s to the 1960s, and it was central in the concept of emancipation. While African American farmers have made enormous contributions through agriculture to the economy, both locally and nationally, historians have largely ignored that role. We hope to shed some light on that subject today as we travel back in time to a place that has 40 acres and a mule, the Freewoods Farm in Horry County, South Carolina. We're telling today's story through the voices of two South Carolina educators and historians. We'll also hear from three active farmers in South Carolina and tell you about research and agricultural education programs designed for minority farmers. Our first historian is Dr. O'Neil Smalls, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Law at the University of South Carolina. Dr. Smalls holds a law degree from Harvard and a bachelor's degree from the historic Tuskegee Institute. He'll talk with us today in his role as president and chair of the Freewoods Foundation, which operates the only historical living farm museum in the United States dedicated to recreating life on farms owned or operated by African Americans. And we'll hear from Dr. Bobby Donaldson, who holds a doctorate from Emory University. He's an associate professor in history and African American studies at the University of South Carolina. We'll begin at Freewoods Farm in the Burgess community in southwest Horry County near Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, a community founded by freed slaves in the 19th century where now stands a living museum and a tribute to that era.
It's pretty clear to me that this is how our people emancipated themselves. So we really are telling the story of the emancipation of a people here. African Americans or Negroes were not emancipated by the signing of a proclamation. After 2.5 centuries of slavery, it took some work to emancipate a people. And this is how they did it. For the first century of freedom, for the first 100 years of freedom, farming was the primary occupation of African Americans. And I think this community is typical. This community tells the story of what they did after slavery. And that's what we seek to do here at Freewoods Farm, is to tell that story of how a people emancipated themselves, what they did after slavery.
So when the Civil War comes on board, there's a big question about the future of land and labor in South Carolina. And it's a question on both sides of the racial divide. On the night of December 31st, 1862, this is the night before the Emancipation Proclamation is rendered, there was a big meeting in Hilton Head at a place called the Penn Center. And there, African Americans are anticipating this new turning point in their lives and their experiences. And so once the Emancipation Proclamation has been rendered, and there's a big discussion about what this ultimately means, for a lot of African Americans, when asked, and they were asked regularly, what do you seek? What do you desire? And for some, it was the right to vote. For some, it was a right to reunite their families. For some, it was the right to rename themselves. But if there were a poll, I suspect the majority would say, we want land and we want entitlement to our own labor. And in many ways, the efforts following emancipation, the efforts following what is called congressional reconstruction, many of those efforts were aimed toward how do you empower these newly freed people who have really themselves as their only property. And so this is where you begin to see Special Field Order Number 15 in 1865. And this is an act that's pushed forward by General Sherman, who comes during that time. And it's January of 1865. And there's a story that General Sherman goes to Savannah, and he meets with a group of ministers. And the question is asked, what does freedom mean to you? And one of the gentlemen, whose name was Garrison Frazier, who was at that time a minister who hailed from South Carolina originally, said it is the right to own our own land. It is the right to benefit from our own labor. And that's inspired the implementation of Field Order 15, later known as 40 Acres and a Mule, which was a real goal to develop land ownership among the freed people, with the real sense that that is the way to sort of guarantee and shore up their freedom. If you have access to land, if you have access to the benefits of your own labor, you're not beholden to others, that will give you the real kind of foundation upon which to build your freedom.
This is 40 acres. And of course, that whole concept of 40 acres and a mule was absolutely critical to the newly freed slaves. They saw the ownership of land as a badge of freedom. It was absolutely critical to them. They wanted land. Of course, many of them didn't get it. A few were able to acquire land. Others became sharecroppers. But we draw no distinction between sharecroppers and those who own their own land, because they did essentially the same thing. They cultivated the same way. They participated in the life of the community essentially in the same way. And so they were emancipated essentially the same as those who were able to acquire tracts of land. Now, in this community, the newly freed slaves were able to acquire land, because you have to sort of go back in time and think about 4 million people being freed after 2.5 centuries of slavery. And 4 million people freed with no land, no money, no formal education, nobody to put them up for a while, just freed and were free to go. There were 3 sympathetic whites who made small tracts of land available to some of the original settlers in this community, with the understanding that they would pay for that land over a period of years with rice. Because all of the newly freed slaves in this community came from plantations down in Georgetown County, and they knew a great deal about growing rice. The sons of the original settlers were able to acquire a little more land. But it really was that 3rd generation, the grandsons of the original settlers, who enlarged the Freewoods community, acquired more land, and turned it into the black farming community it became. And these were men who served in the First World War. And they used their monies from the war and bought land in this community, enlarged it into a black farming community, and it remained a black farming community until the 1960s, until desegregation came. There was a lot of violence around, a lot of hostility in those early periods. Sure. And this community essentially isolated itself. It realized fairly early that if it stayed away from certain activities and what have you, they would essentially be left alone. And that's essentially what occurred. They were left alone to emancipate themselves here. They developed churches. They built churches. It's that whole process of building churches is an interesting part of the history of this community. And around those churches, they developed conventions and associations and reunions. So you had the people in this community making contact with people in other communities through these associations and unions and conventions and conferences, all surrounding the churches.
So there was a real awareness that there was some inequity. And yet, I think African American leadership of the period recognized if people could push beyond the hurdles, whether they are racial hurdles or class hurdles, they could distinguish themselves. And very often the people who were most prominent in South Carolina, who were highly regarded among the white leadership, were African Americans who were landowners or who were successful farmers. Probably the most influential African American leader of the turn of the 20th century was a man named Richard Carroll, who really recognized that if there was going to be a niche in which African Americans could claim and which they could sort of push forward in the future, it would be in agriculture. And so Carroll became very close to some of the very prominent leaders of the state, including Ben Tillman, in really pushing the state to do what it could to empower black land ownership and black farmers.
I think it is the story of the emancipation of a people. This is how our people really emancipated themselves. Because in those early years, from 85 to 90% of African Americans were engaged in farming.
Right. So true.
It is the defining experience of the African American character and culture. Absolutely. If you want to understand African Americans, you have to look at the influence of the farm. The eating habits, the behavior, the worship service, it's all grounded in farming.
Even though economically farmers were disadvantaged in some respects, that was not necessarily an insurmountable hurdle. Despite the disadvantages, you see people who persevered and did quite well. You also see people who really challenged the status quo to seek a better South Carolina for themselves and for their children.
I fully acknowledge that there was a lot of exploitation and bad treatment of sharecroppers. But I also think it's important to keep in mind the enormous contributions those sharecroppers made to the agricultural industry in this country. They helped to establish the great agricultural industry we have in the country today. And they played essentially the same role in developing the community as those farmers who had their own lands. The sharecroppers participated in the churches in the same way. They were deacons and trustees and preachers in the church. They helped to develop the schools. Those farmers built the first schools. The state was not interested in developing an educational system for those newly freed slaves. The farmers built their own schools. And those sharecroppers were just as involved as anyone else. So in looking at sharecropping, I think it's important to keep in mind the contributions they made to the agricultural industry in the South and in the nation.
I mean, one of the real great stories is that places like Voorhees College, Bettis Academy in Trenton, Harbison Institute here in Columbia, these were all colleges and small schools which were designed to actually produce better farmers who were better equipped, who were more knowledgeable, who understood farm management, who understood the basis of soil erosion, crop rotation. So you do see among African Americans a very clear effort to train people to be better farmers. And actually, if there is a positive, it is that in South Carolina, you had people, both black and white, who were very forward-looking and figuring out ways to train people to be better farmers in a moment across the country when to be a small farmer was not necessarily, that there was no guaranteed future if you were on that smaller scale.
We'll continue with this special Black History Month installment of Farm Bureau's Voices of Agriculture when we continue. Hello and welcome back to this special Black History Month edition of Farm Bureau's Voices of Agriculture. I'm your host, Reggie Hall. We've heard from our historians about the foundation that agriculture played in Southern African American history and culture. Now let's travel to the present and meet three African American farmers from South Carolina, each from different parts of the state with varied ages and backgrounds, but with one common thread: their deep-rooted love and calling for agriculture.
Well, as a young kid, and I was just talking to my granddad about it the other day, and I told him thank you for introducing me to a cow. When I was a young boy, he would put me in his truck and we'd go out and feed the cows and check them, and it was amazing. It's something that I clearly loved. I always liked giving all the cows names, and that's what planted the seed right there, just as a young boy feeding cows.
And it's just in our blood. If you got to love it to stay here.
Each with his family roots firmly planted in Southern African American history and culture, young cattleman Emmanuel Bankston, sweet potato farmer Warren Dixon, and small vegetable farmer Willie Ulmer are drawn to the land by their family heritage and deep love of the land.
I was born out here, and I was my father and mother ran into the financial problems, so he sold the whole thing to my brother, and I borrowed enough from the finance company to pay them out.
Like most other farm kids in the South, black and white, Mr. Ulmer took care of routine farm chores before and after school.
We had to take the slop from the hogs from the house, the old house, all the way down to the woods down there to the hogs. And if you forget, you do that at 1 o'clock at night. We pick cotton. We had to go get hands to help pick cotton. And I used to milk the cow, pick cotton, and then beat everybody picking.
Ulmer took leave of Southern living for about 3 decades to work up north on technology that supported nuclear submarines and the space shuttle. But when he had a chance to retire, he and his wife came back to his family's farm, where he grows anything from winter greens to summer vegetables to goats. He's also fortunate enough to have a good friend who just happens to also be named Willie Ulmer. He helps him around the farm. Ulmer helps feed local inmates by selling his produce to the local jail. He has a stand at a local health fair market, and he sells his produce in other area farmers markets.
Well, that's what I want to grow into, because most people now, they know me, and they say, how about the vegetables? And I got quite a few people coming, and we get them right from the field. But the main idea is they want freshness. They don't want nothing wilted.
125 miles away in Aner, South Carolina, near South Carolina's coast, fifth-generation family farmer Warren Dixon credits his success to the movement of his ancestors and previous generations, freed by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation.
My family, come from North Carolina when they got freed, and they inherited this piece, bought this piece of land. My grandfather come around here in 1800, early 1800s, and he bought this place for a 1/4 acre. And my grandsons would be the 6th generation to live on this farm.
Dixon is proud to pass the legacy and the farm to his future generations, like his predecessor did for him.
It makes you very proud when you can go out there and see them little young boys dissing and taking over. It makes you real proud. I mean, to keep this farm going.
And yes, there are young people still enthused about becoming farmers and ranchers who are yielding to agriculture as their life's calling. Take Emmanuel Bankston, for example. He's a junior at Clemson University who can't wait to graduate to become a full-time farmer and rancher. Bankston is active in agriculture through organizations like Farm Bureau. He's a recent member of the organization's Young Farmer and Rancher Committee. He's involved in the Cattlemen's Association and is very involved in the university's agriculture organizations, proving there is a bright future for not only African American farmers, but for all young people with a passion to farm.
I major in agricultural education, and I came in as a pre-vet major, but I quickly changed after a few biology classes. But agricultural education just fit me. I came up through Farm Bureau youth programs, as you mentioned, as well as the FFA program. And before I knew it, I thought Ag Ed was where I should be. I get a variety of classes to take, from soils to animal science classes, and I minor in animal science as well, so I just get a very broad spectrum of the ag world.
We'll have more when Farm Bureau's Voices of Agriculture continues. Welcome back. While government programs and those with a keen memory of the greater past may refer to African American farmers as disadvantaged, limited resource, or small farmers, nothing could be further from the truth. The people we talked with are in no way disadvantaged in their endeavors or in their spirit. In fact, each has a strong support system at their beck and call through the federal land grant system developed especially for African American farmers. Known as the 1890 Research and Extension Program, it is administered in South Carolina by SC State University and Dr. Dale Wesson, Vice President for Research, Economic Development, and Public Service.
It has the three-prong approach of teaching, research, and extension. And what we actually use, the extension is a way to get the research into the common man, is what we call it, so that we can get the actual technology and development into the workforce.
South Carolina's other land grant institution is Clemson University. Dr. Wesson says the two programs are very closely aligned, as their plans of work are coordinated with no duplication of services or research. One program complements the other. Farm Bureau's Voices of Agriculture will continue in a moment. Whether it's because of their ancestry, their proud heritage, their faith in God, or the fact that they are like most other farmers, each of the farmers we interviewed for this special edition say they are blessed to be farmers, that they have had a good fortune to be treated fairly, and each is respected for his hard work and dedication to agriculture. Each of these men has learned and achieved because of his past, knowing it's the future to which they most look forward. They have a proud heritage and a promising future.
We've got one more class of GAP training. You're going to be certified to accept WIC and food stamps and that type of thing. So you have to attend that class if you want to accept, if you want to be able to accept those cards. So I'll make sure that I attend that, and so that we can get certified to do that.
I consider myself a farmer. I don't, because when I go out to the store and chat with the boys, it's all the other race, and I just consider myself a farmer.
But the main dream would be to rent land, to buy land, and to run cattle. That's what I always wanted to do.
Well, that's all the time we have for South Carolina's installment of Farm Bureau's Voices of Agriculture. We hope you've enjoyed watching this special Black History Month installment and learned something about the role agriculture and African American history and culture have played in the history of South Carolina as well as across the nation. To learn more about this program, log on to our website, scfb.org. We also invite you to like us on Facebook and to follow us on Twitter. Until next time, I'm your host, Reggie Hall. Thanks for watching.